Throughout history, individuals have periodically emerged who refuse to conform to the world around them, and who, for better or worse, have made it their life's purpose to bring about change. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, better known as Che Guevara, was one of these individuals. Throughout his life, and in analysis of his legacy following his death, Che Guevara's name has been linked with numerous contradicting labels. Some called him a humanitarian, while others called him a murderer. Some called him a visionary, while some others called him a naive idealist. In this video, we'll explore the life story of Che Guevara and uncover the true face of the man behind the 20th century's most influential revolutions, from his birth in Argentina to his untimely death in Bolivia.
I take pride in the word history and ideological.
Che Guevara was born in Rosario, Argentina, to Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna, officially on June 14, 1928. However, his actual birthday was a month earlier, on May 14th. As Che had been conceived out of wedlock, a doctor who was a family friend falsified the date of birth to avoid scandal. The Guevara family, on both sides, had noble ancestry traceable to the early Spanish gentry in Argentina. Over the generations, however, the paternal side of Che's family lost most of its wealth, while his mother Celia's family remained relatively well off. Still, with 5 children, Che being the eldest, and 2 failed business ventures, one involving a yerba mate plantation and the other shipyards, the Guevaras ultimately settled into the middle class. Che spent the first year of his life on a homestead at the aforementioned yerba mate plantation, located in the province of Misiones. After the plantation failed, the family resettled in the Buenos Aires area, first in San Isidro, then in the city of Buenos Aires proper. His father, Ernesto, had hoped to one day return to the plantation and revive the business. However, it soon became clear that the humid climate there was triggering Che's increasingly severe asthma attacks. As a result, the family eventually relocated to the small town of Alta Gracia in the early 1930s, a resort town known for its dry climate, in hopes that it would alleviate Che's respiratory problems. Because Che was such a sickly child, he was mostly homeschooled by his mother, which undoubtedly led to the formation of their unique bond. Indeed, Che's personality became increasingly similar to that of his mother: rebellious, opinionated, decisive, and danger-seeking. Che was also close to his paternal grandmother Anna Isabel, but especially to his childless paternal aunt Beatrice, who doted on him. Often, the young Che Guevara was so feeble that he couldn't even walk, and had to stay in bed for days on end. He was not happy with being kept indoors because of his condition, and became devoted to sports to strengthen his health. In particular, Che excelled at rugby, usually playing the position of forward. As he grew older, the asthma attacks became more manageable and occurred less frequently. This allowed Che to attend school on a regular basis. As recalled by the schoolmaster of his primary school, Elba Rossi de Oviedo, Che was a mischievous boy, but also one who exhibited strong independence and leadership qualities. Others who knew him as a youth also remembered him for his fearlessness, stubbornness, and competitive spirit. These qualities perhaps reflect the upbringing his parents facilitated at home. Both Ernesto and Celia thought it was important for their children to think for themselves. In their parenting, the pair rarely spoke of religion except to criticize the conservative-minded Catholic Church, and they encouraged the children to think and discuss anything they would like. Furthermore, Che's parents were firm left-wing sympathizers, particularly his mother Celia, who was not only further left on the political spectrum, but was also known to actively reject the rigid social norms of the time. They expressed strong support for the Republican cause during the Spanish Civil War, de Gaulle's Free French forces during World War II, and opposed the semi-authoritarian regime of Juan Perón. Under this highly politicized environment, Che grew up to inherit many of his parents' beliefs. By the time he graduated from secondary school in 1946, at the age of 18, Che was a well-read, sportive, and handsome young man with a particular affinity for poetry. In 1948, at the University of Buenos Aires, Che enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine. He was passionate about his studies, but he was also eager to explore the world around him, and so he interspersed his studies with long periods of traveling. The first was in 1950, when Che traveled throughout northern Argentina by himself. and the second took place from 1951 to 1952, when he was accompanied by his close friend Alberto Granado, with whom he would travel across Latin America and even reach Miami. During these trips, Che went to rural areas far from the big cities and came across the homeless, laborers, poor indigenous villagers, and other people marginalized by the mainstream European-descended establishment, to which Che himself belonged. Che would also use hospitals and police stations as hostels, often asking to stay the night in an empty jail cell or hospital bed. As a result, for the first time in his life, Che witnessed the harsh reality of the less fortunate. Indeed, it was during these trips that Che's concerns for the working class first emerged. When Che returned from his travels, he finished the last of his courses and graduated from medical school. At the same time, his political consciousness and early leanings towards socialism were rapidly maturing and solidifying. These beliefs would become set in stone when Che decided to travel once again, this time accompanied by another friend, Carlos Ferrer, who was nicknamed Calica. Unbeknownst to Che's parents, this time Che was going to be gone for years, and the next time they met, he would no longer be simply a socialist-minded doctor, but an internationalist revolutionary known throughout the world. With Calica, as well as other left-wing exiles they met on the way, Che would eventually arrive in Guatemala in late December 1953 to observe the ongoing reforms of the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz. While in Guatemala, Che met Hilda Gadea, a well-connected Peruvian exile who was a member of the left-leaning American Popular Revolutionary Alliance, or APRA. With Gadea's help, Che became acquainted with high-ranking officials of the Arbenz government and devoted himself to becoming a true revolutionary. Additionally, Che also met with a group of Cuban exiles in Guatemala who were part of Fidel Castro's failed attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Little did Che know at the time that his path was to be intertwined with theirs. Che, who deeply admired Jacobo Arbenz, was outraged when the US-sponsored coup against the socialist president occurred. He joined a communist youth militia to fight on Arbenz's behalf, while also serving in a medical capacity. However, Arbenz eventually resigned under tremendous pressure and took refuge in the Mexican embassy. Che, for his vocal support for Arbenz, became a target for the coup's supporters, leading him to flee with Hilda to Mexico. What Che saw in Guatemala was to have a lasting impact on his political philosophy. The overthrow of the Arbenz government and the subsequent installation of a right-wing dictatorship solidified Guevara's belief that the United States was an imperialist power determined to suppress any government that aimed to address the socio-economic inequalities in Latin America and other developing nations. This conviction pushed Che from being a socialist-minded observer to a firm Marxist who believed in the necessity of armed struggle. In Mexico, Che continued to practice medicine and treated those in poverty. He also reconnected with the Cuban exiles he met in Guatemala, one of whom, Nico Lopez, introduced him to Raul Castro, who then introduced Che to his brother Fidel Castro. Che soon became convinced that Castro's 26th of July movement was his calling all this time, and decided that the Cuban government under Fulgencio Batista was nothing more than an American puppet. Che and Fidel also developed a close friendship, although their strong personalities sometimes led to friction between the two. Che began training alongside Fidel Castro's guerrilla fighters under instructor Alberto Bayo. His performance during the grueling training was excellent, and soon it was time to leave for Cuba to fulfill their mission. Shortly before the group departed for Mexico, in September 1955, Che and Hilda Gadea also got married, after Hilda became pregnant. The couple was then joined by Fidel and his forces, with whom they boarded the Grama, a yacht purchased with 50,000 Mexican pesos, roughly $4,000 in 1956. The Grama left from Tuxpan, Veracruz on November 25, 1956, for Playa Las Coloradas, a location chosen to emulate the journey of Jose Marti, a Cuban national hero who fought against Spain for Cuban independence in 1895. The journey was a difficult one, with those on board suffering from seasickness, a lack of supplies, and the ship was even close to sinking due to a leakage. Despite these issues, however, on December 2nd, the group landed at Playa Las Coloradas in Cuba, and was immediately attacked by Batista's forces, killing the majority of Castro's men. Out of 82, only 22 survived and regrouped in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Thus began the most challenging days for the rebels, hiding and training in the mountains while being hunted by government forces. During this time, Guevara abandoned his role as a medic and symbolically took up arms, marking a turning point in his revolutionary identity. While living amongst impoverished Cuban peasants, Guevara became deeply aware of their lack of education, healthcare, and infrastructure, prompting him to establish schools, clinics, and workshops alongside organizing guerrilla tactics and supply chains. Che's contributions to Castro's campaign soon led to his promotion to Comandante, the first among the guerrilla fighters to be given such honor, and Che became Castro's second-in-command. With his newfound rank and authority, a more brutal and violent side of Guevara began to emerge. He enforced strict discipline through executions of deserters and suspected traitors. Despite his harshness, he was respected by his troops, reading literature to them and ensuring they taught literacy to locals, as part of what he called the battle against ignorance. Fidel Castro praised Guevara's intelligence, courage, and moral authority, although he also noted his tendency towards reckless bravery. In 1958, Guevara played a decisive role in halting Batista's encirclement strategy at the Battle of Las Mercedes, demonstrating his mastery of guerrilla warfare's hit-and-run tactics. In the revolution's final phase, Guevara led a grueling 7-week march west and seized almost all of Las Villas province. He then led a critical assault on Santa Clara in late December 1958, where he achieved victory despite being heavily outnumbered. The fall of Santa Clara triggered Batista's flight from Cuba on January 1, 1959. Guevara entered Havana the next day, with Castro arriving a week later to complete the revolution. The war against Batista had been a struggle, and Che himself recalled this period as the most painful part of the revolution. When the dust settled, an estimated 2,000 people had died during the 2-year conflict. The victorious rebels were now made into national heroes in the newspapers, radio, and in statues. Che, with his good looks and charisma, was now known internationally. Back home in Buenos Aires, Che's father Ernesto recalled that his son's actions in Cuba were the only thing people could talk about. On January 9, 1959, Che's parents arrived in Cuba to visit their son, and the look on their faces could not have been more proud. They stayed at the Hilton Hotel as honored guests, and Ernesto even brought along a bottle of Argentinian wine as a gift from home. Ernesto wrote of this time and said that as they celebrated, he thought he could see in his physique, in his expressions, in his happiness, the same boy who had left Buenos Aires one cold July afternoon more than 6 years before. Not all was good news, however. As the fighting concluded in Cuba, so did Che's marriage to Hilda Gadea. During the years of armed struggle and the rebels' time hiding in the mountains, Che had become close to and eventually falling in love with a fellow guerrilla fighter, Hilda March, who was 8 years his junior. March was also not the only woman Che was involved with during his time in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. There was also a young girl named Zola Rodriguez, with whom Che was in a relationship briefly. After his divorce from Hilda was finalized, Che and Hilda married in 1959 at the Cabana military fortress Che commanded. Unfortunately, there was little time to enjoy the marital bliss of his second marriage and his parents' visit, as Che was occupied by the task given to him by Fidel Castro to lead the revolutionary tribunals for the Batista government officials and collaborators. As with most revolutions, when the fighting stops, a purge usually follows. Thus began one of the most controversial chapters of Che Guevara's life. Accounts of Che's involvement with the tribunals vary greatly, and it's difficult to get a definitive understanding of Che's actions during this time. It is speculated that under Che's command, some 55 to 105 people were executed under dubious legal processes. The number of those executed has also been estimated at nearly 500. Again, the true number is something that we might never find out. That being said, with the passion of the revolution running high, the majority of Cubans approved of the Revolutionary Tribunal's decisions. Their anger towards Batista's supporters was perhaps understandable. After all, the brutality of the former regime cannot be understated. As to Che's attitude towards the executions, there is likewise disagreement. Some historians argue that Che was enthusiastic about them, while others argue that he pardoned as many as he could. In any case, what is certain is that by this time, after years of guerrilla warfare and his experience in Guatemala, Che was a hardened man, committed to the revolution and armed struggle. He believed that the executions were necessary for the survival of the revolution, and often cited Jacobo Arbenz' failure to purge the military and government as the former president's greatest mistake, one that they could not afford to repeat. Che's cold-heartedness in his administration of the tribunals can be seen in the execution of Colonel Cornelio Rojas, who was one of the first individuals he sentenced to death.
Colonel Rojas was the police chief of Santa Clara and fought against the rebels till the very end, and his entire execution was filmed and broadcast on television. Initially, Colonel Rojas' family was relieved to see him alive, standing against a wall. But as the camera zoomed out, they were terrified to see the firing squad with their guns pointed at Colonel Rojas. There was nothing they could do but scream in terror as they watched Colonel Rojas being gunned down, the bullets sending his hat flying across the screen. In his memoirs, Che's father Ernesto avoided speaking about his son's role in the tribunals, but he did touch on the shock he felt when he realized how much his son had changed. He recalled the answer he got from Che when he asked what was going to happen to his medical career. Che replied, "As for my medical career, I can tell you that I deserted it a long time ago. Now I am a fighter who is working for the consolidation of a government. What will become of me? I don't even know in which land I will leave my bones." This was the moment the elder Ernesto realized the son he knew was gone. He wrote of his reaction to this exchange with the following: "It was hard for me to recognize the Ernesto of my home, the normal Ernesto. He had been transformed into a man whose faith in the triumph of his ideals reached mystical proportions. Others, who knew Che since before he became a revolutionary, also shared his father's shock, and perhaps disappointment. Tatiana Quiroga, an old friend from medical school, whom Che had kept in touch with during the years of his travels, sent a telegram to congratulate him on his victory in Cuba. She later moved to Los Angeles and wrote, "I sent a telegram to La Campana, and it cost me $5. I still remember because as a student, it was a lot of money for me. But I spent the $5 to congratulate him. Then came the killings of La Campana, and I'll tell you, I have never felt so horrible as to have spent $5 on that telegram. I wanted to die." It is interesting to note here that perhaps Che himself was aware of the toll his transformation into the hardened revolutionary was taking. As noted in John Lee Anderson's biography of Che Guevara, titled Che, A Revolutionary Life, Anderson pointed out that although he was careful to conceal it, Che was paying a personal price for the austere revolutionary image he had constructed for himself. There was a softer side to Che Guevara, which could be seen in his relationships with women, as well as his attachment to animals and pets. These could all be taken as signs that he craved tenderness and solace to ease the harsh life he had adopted, and Che took great precaution to ensure they were kept private. When the tribunals were finally over, Che transitioned to governing roles. In a life-defining moment on January 27, 1959, Guevara made his famous speech titled The Social Ideas of the Rebel Army, laying out his political philosophy and plans for reforming Cuban society. Following this, Che drafted and introduced an agrarian reform law that redistributed land and went on an extensive tour of various countries. Soon after Che returned to Cuba, in September of 1959, he was given the position of Minister of Finance and President of the National Bank. These positions, in combination with his pre-existing roles as Minister of Industries and head of the Instruction Department of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, gave Che enormous influence over Cuban society. He got to work enacting economic reforms, social reforms, and improving literacy rates. In particular, Che introduced the philosophy of the new man to the Cuban public, which advocated for a new understanding of masculinity, one that prioritized selflessness, obedience, hard work, anti-materialism, and anti-imperialism. Che had hoped the idea of the new man would create a society that placed the common good over individual desires. However, despite his efforts, Che later admitted that peasants still felt a sense of private ownership and were not devoted to the common good. His economic policies, such as the 4-year plan proposed to rapidly industrialize Cuba, did not bring about the growth he wanted to see, although he was successful in raising literacy rates and maintaining the combat readiness of the Revolutionary Armed Forces. In fact, Che's role in training and equipping the Revolutionary Armed Forces was a major factor in Cuba's successful deterrence of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place on April 17, 1961. This greatly improved the standing of the revolutionary government in the minds of Cuban citizens. Afterwards, Che sent a note of, quote, gratitude to President John F. Kennedy that said, "Thanks for Bay of Pigs. Before the invasion, the revolution was shaky. Now, it's stronger than ever." Beginning in 1964, Che emerged as one of Cuba's foremost international diplomats. He gave a famous speech at the UN criticizing apartheid South Africa and domestic racism in the United States. He also continued to visit foreign countries, including Algeria, which proved to be a turning point in Che's path with Fidel Castro. On February 24, 1965, Che delivered a speech in Algiers, capital of Algeria, in which he publicly attacked the Soviet Union, accusing it of conspiring with the United States to exploit the Southern Hemisphere. As the Sino-Soviet split worsened during this period, Che became increasingly supportive of Communist China and viewed the Soviet Union as having deviated from Marx's original vision with its incrementalist approach and policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. Che's opinion of the Soviet Union was also negatively impacted by its de-escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Che viewed as a cowardly decision. This public denouncement of the Soviet Union reportedly led to heated disagreements between Che and Fidel Castro when the former returned to Cuba 2 weeks later. Castro had hoped to maintain cordial relations with the Soviets, and either disagree with Che's criticism or thought that they should not have been expressed publicly. Soon after that, Che disappeared from the public eye. Then, on October 3, 1965, Castro revealed to the public a letter supposedly written to him by Guevara around 7 months earlier. In the letter, Guevara reaffirmed his solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, but declared his intention to leave Cuba to fight for revolutionary struggles overseas. He also resigned from all his roles within the Cuban government and Communist Party, as well as relinquished his honorary Cuban citizenship. Indeed, by the time Che's farewell letter was made public in Cuba, he was already in Africa, fighting in the Congo crisis. He and around 100 Cuban soldiers had allied themselves with the forces of Laurent Désiré Kabila, with hopes of bringing about a Cuban-style revolution that will lead to the creation of a socialist state. Many of Che's allies advised him that it was a bad plan, including Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, as well as Fidel Castro himself. Their warning turned out to be true. Almost all of Che's men had died either from the fighting or illness, and Laurent Désiré Kabila proved an unreliable ally. Che later reflected on the Congo crisis with the following comment: "The human element failed. There is no will to fight. The leaders are corrupt. In a word, there was nothing to do." He also added, "We cannot liberate, all by ourselves, a country that does not want to fight." Che eventually chose to retreat from the hopeless fight in Congo, briefly staying at the Cuban embassy in Tanzania and then a safe house near Prague. He was reluctant to return to Cuba as his farewell letter had already been announced, so it'd be embarrassing to suddenly return. While he was in Europe, Che also paid a visit to former Argentinian President Juan Perón, who was living in exile in Spain. During their meeting, Che confided in Perón his plan to establish a foothold in Bolivia, which he would use as a base of operations to expand socialist control over the rest of Latin America. Upon hearing this, Perón told Che that this plan was not only suicidal but also futile. But of course, this did little to change his mind. Perón later recalled this meeting and said, "Che was an immature utopian, but one of us. I am happy for it to be so because he was giving the Yankees a real headache." Before he left for Bolivia, Che secretly returned to Cuba and met with Fidel Castro one last time. While the content of their final meeting has never been documented, Che likely wanted to say goodbye to an old friend and relive some of the memories they had shared over their years of partnership. Che also saw his wife, Hilda March, and gave her a letter for their children that was to be read upon his death. The letter ended with the following statement: "Above all, always be capable of feeling deeply any injustice committed against anyone, anywhere in the world. This is the most beautiful quality in a revolutionary." With that, Che left Cuba for Uruguay, where he disguised himself and assumed the false identity of Adolfo Mena Gonzalez, posing as a middle-aged Uruguayan businessman working for the Organization of American States. He arrived in La Paz, Bolivia, then traveled southeast towards the rural region of Ñancahuazú. There, Che set up camp, and with the help of his Argentine-born East German agent Tamara Bunke, began recruiting for his guerrilla army. Eventually, Che and Tamara Bunke managed to expand their number to about 50 men. They called themselves the ELN, or the National Liberation Army of Bolivia. The guerrillas were well equipped and achieved several victories early on. However, due to a lack of local support, faulty equipment that hindered communication with Havana, and the unexpected presence of the CIA and US Special Forces, the tide soon turned against Che's small guerrilla army. Che's treatment of Bolivians also proved detrimental to his cause. When his attempt to win the support of the locals failed, Che became frustrated and turned to violence. This led to many turning against Che and throwing their support behind the Bolivian government and the CIA, the latter being led by Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban exile turned CIA operative. On October 7, 1967, the Bolivian Special Forces were alerted of Che's encampment in the Ural Ravine by an informant. They soon had the area surrounded by 2 companies of roughly 180 soldiers. In the battle that ensued, most of the rebels were wiped out. The rest were captured alongside Che Guevara himself. Che was taken to a school in the nearby village of La Higuera on the evening of October 8th to be interrogated. Despite the bullet wound in his leg, the dirt covering his body, and his tattered clothes, Che remained defiant, just like he did as a rebellious young boy all those years ago in Argentina. But defiant as he may have been, Che could not escape his own mortality when, on October 9th, the order came through from Bolivian President René Barrientos that Che Guevara was to be executed immediately. With that, Che's fate was sealed. Sergeant Mario Terán, who volunteered to be the executioner, shot him 9 times across his body. Che fell to the ground and bit his wrist to avoid crying out in pain, before he bled out and died. His last words, which he shouted towards Terán, were, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." After Che Guevara's execution, his hands were cut off, and his body was displayed in Valle Grande, Bolivia, where its site was likened to Christ by locals and foreign observers alike. In Cuba, Fidel Castro publicly mourned Guevara, praising him as a moral exemplar and revolutionary model. Guevara's image became a global symbol of resistance, inspiring protest and revolutionary movements from Latin America to Europe, Africa, and Asia. His philosophy, emphasizing moral over material incentives, will continue to influence Cuban policies for decades to come. To this day, Che Guevara's legacy remains deeply polarized and complex. Admirers see him as a heroic embodiment of justice and self-sacrifice, while critics denounce him as a dogmatic figure who suppressed dissidents and glorified violence. In this sense, perhaps, Che Guevara has always remained faithful and consistent to the path he set out to tread. That is, to be a revolutionary who challenged our values of what's right and what's wrong. What do you make of Che Guevara's life and legacy? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe, as I will be making more videos on Cold War related topics. Thank you for your support. See you next time.